We've been privileged to work with VMA and be part of the sponsorship roles for the last probably 4 years now. I'm really keen to have a listen to this session. There's, it's deep in my area as well, and I'm really keen to hear some of the stuff that's going on. Obviously, we're in a situation now with venues that there's been a key focus on COVID safety, those sorts of things, but there's still obviously a requirement to talk about all those other 400 risks that you have in your profile. So without further ado, handing it over to the team.
So this session, Managing Risk in Venues. Our facilitator is Wayne Middleton, who needs little introduction in this forum. Wayne is a risk management consultant and principal of Reliance Risk. Reliance Risk helps public venues, events, sports and companies in the entertainment industry to manage risk. He's over 30 years' experience in management and operational roles in venues and event industries, and over 20 years as a risk management professional. He's a venue management school graduate and is the chair of the venue management school. Wayne holds a master's degree in risk management, a Bachelor of Business Administration and a diploma in security risk management. He also holds a certified venue executive designation awarded by the International Association of Venue Managers. Please welcome Wayne and his panel.
Thanks, Heather. Hi, everyone. Just, I guess, a little personal story. My wife, Eugenia, came home last night saying I've got a scratchy throat and not feeling so well. And then she had walked out of her office and saw one of those pop-up COVID clinics in Martin Place. So she'd taken one for the team, which is terrific. Of course, then woken up this morning thinking, okay, we don't actually have a result yet. And how's this going to play out? So, of course, I've been on the phone to Michael, and at one point we were contemplating me sitting in my car outside facilitating this session. So, thank goodness New South Wales Health is onto it, and within 12 hours we had a result. She is negative, by the way, and all is good. But I guess it just goes to show the challenges and the uncertainty that we've all had this year, and we heard in the last session, this concept of resilience and being able to take the hits and bounce back. We've got a terrific panel here, and I'll introduce them in a second. Again, as was said earlier, for those of our colleagues in Melbourne who've taken so many hits themselves this year, and we're thinking of them, and we'll look forward to seeing them all again soon. And I made the point about vaccinations before, and I know it's a personal choice, but I think the reality is, from what we're seeing about the level of contagion and the way COVID is mutating, that we really need to be encouraging vaccinations and getting out there. You no doubt will agree that our understanding and engagement in risk management has changed a lot in the last year. Apart from that term, resilience, I don't think I've ever heard the term risk management brought up so much. And it's really highlighted how something that's a 1 in 100 year event conceptually is something that can bite us in the backside so much. And if we'd had this conversation 2 years ago, there would have been a lot of eye rolling if we'd actually been talking about pandemic planning. It's brought a new focus to us all on health and safety compliance, of course, on how we manage stakeholders while navigating a crisis, how we maintain business continuity, and some of those linkages. Now, this isn't a VMS lecture, of course, but I've tried here just to capture conceptually what I think are some of the risk areas that we now encounter, that perhaps there are more there than were in the past. If you think, and I've tried to break those down into sort of the external risk drivers and then some more internal, and of course our focus shortly will be on some of those points in the middle. But if you think about it, and the session in Brisbane last week about counter-terrorism and the geopolitical environment and how that continues to evolve, and issues that are happening on the other side of the world are influencing the planning that we have to do in our venues in relation to counter-terrorism. And obviously the economy is a double-edged sword at the moment, because there are some parts of the economy that are hurting terribly, but there's opportunities throughout all that. And we heard it again in the last session about climate and climate change. And for those of you from Sydney who worked at the SCG for the Test cricket and planning for that, or in Melbourne for the Australian Open, and how terrible it was to see the ground covered in smoke and the impact that was having on elite sport. And obviously the cyclical nature of climate, and we know now that those 1 in a 100-year events are now going to be more frequent and more severe. And of course supply chain, the most classic example in the 12 months being toilet paper. And I'm sure we've got a big stock here at Kudos Bank Arena. I know Department of Health had a warehouse operating here in Olympic Park. But we've also heard the supply issues that we're now encountering with labour force, both from a casual workforce, and we've all in our venues had, the knowledge of our venues leave with some of our managers. So, it's reinforced the importance of taking an all-hazards approach to managing risk. You can't ignore one for the other. I'd encourage all organisations now really to be looking more broadly at risks, both in terms of opportunities and compliance. For those venues that have been fortunate enough to reopen, there's been a really strong focus over the last year on compliance with public health orders, on capacity and seating restrictions, on venue staffing and training and contact tracing systems. But importantly, it's forced us to revisit our legal responsibilities, our ticketing terms and conditions, our venue hire agreements, our health and safety duties, our liabilities, and of course force majeure, just being some. The list goes on. So today we're going to focus on that central part. The list of adverse scenarios in what I'd call the Venue Manager's Handbook continues to grow. And while many of the responsibilities fit squarely with the venues, some of those responsibilities are shared, as we know. They're shared with the hirer, they're shared with our contractors, they're shared with our staff, and of course our patrons have got some responsibilities when they walk onto the site as well. So today we're going to try and drill into some of that in terms of those responsibilities and from both an operator, from a contractor, and from a legal perspective. I'd now like to introduce my panellists. So I'll introduce you first to Lea Constantine. I've actually known Lea for 20 plus years. Lea is a partner at Ashurst and leads the firm's work health and safety practice. She advises clients on all aspects of work health and safety in a range of industry sectors, including construction, energy, banking, health, and of course in venues. Clients call upon Lea's expertise and experience when dealing with sensitive safety-related issues, including workplace fatalities. She's presented to many boards of directors on safety issues and regularly provides advice on safety-related governance. She's an experienced safety litigator and has advised and appeared in a number of major safety prosecutions and coronial inquests. Lea is also the head of Ashurst's Global Strategic Advisory Division and sits on their firm's executive team. So welcome, Lea. On the far end, I've got Stephen Davey. Stephen and I have worked side by side for projects with the National Rugby League over a few years. Stephen has over 20 years experience as an events producer with a career that spans television, arts, cultural events, sports presentations, community, as well as corporate and private events. Stephen's the owner and managing director of The Spark. They're a company that delivers end-to-end creative event production management. Stephen successfully delivered very complex, multi-staged events in a range of traditional and non-traditional venues within Australia and overseas. Now, Stephen's very busy at the moment because he's also helping to produce some of the production elements for State of Origin next week up in Townsville. I'd like to then also introduce Sue Max, and I have also known Sue for more than 20 years. She's the General Manager in Venue Management for Venues Live. She works just across the way here. She's been in sport and the event industry since 1985 and worked across a range of sports before joining SOCOG for the Olympic Games, and that's where we first met. She worked as part of in an operations role for the venue management department for SOCOG, and her role then focused on overlay design and operational planning for various venues within the Sydney Olympic Park precinct, including Stadium Australia. Sue then went ahead and joined Venues Live's Venue Management Department in February in 1999 while on secondment for SOCOG, and then as a permanent employee not long after the stadium opened. In 2004, she moved into the GM role in event and venue management, a position she's held until 2020, and was responsible for the day-to-day operations of the venue and leading the planning and delivering of all the events, both for the stadium here and Bankwest Stadium out west. She's got an extensive experience across all facets of event operations, venue operations, as well as staffing and other services. She manages a range of clients and supply contracts, including security, ticketing, medical, cleaning, waste management, and the list goes on. Sue is also one of our venue management school instructors, which we're very proud to have her on board, and is also on the VMS committee. Please join me in welcoming the panel. All right, so Sue's digital team has done a terrific job in pulling this little video together. Terrific. All right, so let's start, and unfortunately we only have 45 minutes left, but there's probably a couple of hours worth just in that video alone. I might start with you, Sue. How does risk planning occur in planning for something like that, and what are your responsibilities that are set out under the venue hire agreement?
I'll certainly let...
Microphone.
Oh, I need a mic. Can you hear me? Yes. My apologies. Certainly for us, the earlier we can start with our planning, the better. It gives time to obviously liaise with all of the various stakeholders that we need to, and along with Steve, who's representing our hirer, who will be the NRL for an event such as this. We're certainly looking at all of those things that can go wrong. The hilarious thing about venue managers is that we hate risk, but we have to manage that, and that sometimes means we can't always say no. So we start to work through that process nice and early. Certainly through our ticketing, through our event general manager is very early starting to look about how we bring people into the venue. Certainly the biggest risk for venues such as our own, large venues, but I would say most venues, is we're safe as long as everyone's sitting in their seat and not doing anything. It does get a little more risky, obviously, when people start to move. So a lot of our early management is what does that ticketing build look like, how are we seating people, how are we bringing people into the venue. And that will start fairly early. Sometimes for some events it could be 12 or 18 months, as many of you would know, before the event starts. The next stage for us, if we're talking about what we've just seen, is inviting Steve to come and talk to us about some of the ideas he's got around entertainment. And for us, again, we call it the dance. And the dance begins, as I said, with Steve coming to see us. It's like a really bad date. Steve comes full of optimism and hoping that we're going to go on a second date. We're sitting at the table probably fairly poker-faced and just wanting to hear what he's got to say before we actually decide whether we're going to agree to it or not. So without making a joke out of that, there is a process, a planning process that we have to go through, which talks about what Steve is is going to do in representing the hirer, what are those risks for us for the things that we're responsible for, which primarily is around public safety and making sure that we can get the event away. Image and reputation is very important as well as a part of that. But at the same time, it's finding a way to help Steve achieve what he needs to achieve for his client and also for the customer experience, because grand final would be pretty boring without all of those shiny bits and the other things that go on with it, and the entertainment is also very important to us as well. So I guess the main thing in answering the question is we start early, we start to look for all of our risks, and then we start to obviously engage with our very important stakeholders, being our hirer, about what they want to achieve for that particular event as well.
Great, thanks Sue. Stephen, you've been dancing and dating at ANZ Stadium for some time. What's your take on the planning process and the responsibilities that you guys have?
Yes, it's not perhaps too different to how Sue described it. The dance, I do come in very optimistic that I'll get a second date. I think it starts, and it starts. My role is I work with the NRL as an agent for them to produce the show, and the first bit that I sort of do with the NRL, but also the stadium in this instance, is just assess what an appetite for risk looks like for everybody. Like what do we want to achieve for the show, and sort of the NRL has elements in there, and obviously we will then take that to the stadium and get an understanding about, well, how do you feel about landing a helicopter on the field, or bringing out 1,000 people into the middle of the field, or whatever that might be. We sort of start to I guess, delve into the bits that we would like to deliver and start to understand how people are viewing that differently.
Right. And I guess, you know, given what Sue said about the amount of time and the earlier the better required for planning, that in itself has created some serious challenges for Townsville and Game 1 next week.
Certainly with Townsville that's a challenge, yeah, sort of getting 9 days to sort of move something that we'd been in planning for 4 months, 5 months. That's the team are under a fair bit of pressure at the moment, and that's both the guys up in Townsville who are being brilliant, I must say, and our team and the NRL, and there are a whole number of stakeholders at the moment that are just sort of really pushing to get the show on and the game on.
Right. I've got a slide here that we were actually commissioned a couple of years ago by the NRL to do a review on sort of roles and responsibilities and duty of care and where it starts and stops as it relates to the venue and the suppliers and the third-party production elements. And I mean, that's just an example here where obviously there are some specific responsibilities that are set out under the venue hire agreement. There are elements that primarily the NRL owns. There are other elements that are shared, and a good example there is, you know, obviously the field of play and the management of people and players and VIPs, and the transportation, getting them out of level 0 if there was an emergency, management of the change rooms, the stop show process, which, Stephen, your role, particularly in an emergency at certain periods in the lead up to the event and at half time, are critical in terms of the sequencing of some of that. Emergency management, and one of the outcomes of this project was that safety and security is the responsibility of the venue, and I think, you know, we'll get onto the venue hire agreements in general. Most, in fact, probably all venue hire agreements in the country would say that, but in terms of the liability that goes along with that, it's the hirer's responsibility to pay if it goes pear-shaped, and Lea, you're in a far better position to comment on that than me, but that was certainly one of the findings. And this is not, of course, limited to rugby league and hosting in major stadiums. The same sort of concept applies, that this shared responsibility between some parties, and I guess the important point is just to go on the front foot between all of the stakeholders and work through and ensure that everybody understands who's doing what. Now, Lea, how far do the venues need to go with regards to reviewing documentation? Obviously, venue hire agreements, we're asking third-party suppliers and hirers to provide information to satisfy ourselves that they've got their act together. What sort of things are we supposed to be asking? How far should we go?
God, if I knew the answer to that question, maybe none of you would be here and I wouldn't be here. Look, there's quite a few schools of thought about how far do you go, because in my world, in the legal world, the further you go into looking at things like agreements, the way in which tasks are to be performed or a setup is to be undertaken, the further you go into that space, and once you start inserting yourself into the work of others, from a legal point of view, what happens is that you start to take on perhaps more liability that you would otherwise have if you stayed out of it. So it's a bit counterintuitive, I know what it is that I'm saying, but it really comes back to what you said just a second ago, Wayne, about the way in which the law operates in work health and safety and the respective roles and responsibilities of each of the parties. When you look at that slide, there's a lot of different parties, each of whom have duties, and the million-dollar question is really working out where a duty starts, where a duty ends, and there's no set answer, unfortunately. I'll give you a typical lawyer's answer now. There's no set answer to that sort of question. So it's one of those aspects, I think, each and every time where you need to look at what is it that I know as a venue, what is it that I need to know as a hirer, what is the exchange of that information, what does that look like, how much information am I obliged as a venue to give to a hirer, what does the hirer do with that information. So there's actually lots of little steps in all of this. One thing just to add to something you also mentioned, Wayne, overarching all of this is this concept in the work health and safety laws, which I'm sure you're familiar with, and that is that what we have under work health and safety laws is what we call concurrent duty holders. And what that means is when Wayne puts that slide up and has all the various parties that are depicted there, the bottom line with that is that each and every party has a role in work health and safety. It's a matter of just discerning what that role is, and as you asked, where the duties start and where the duties end. And if in your own mind, I suppose they end at a point, but you go further than that, my message is you may be taking on more liability. So it's one of those things you need to, very well understand what your factual circumstance is, what it is that you're trying to achieve, what you do know, what your information is that you actually have, what information you're obliged to pass on, and all the grey lines that sit between all of that.
So clear as mud.
Clear as mud.
I guess, and the challenge out of all this, and when we discussed this in prep for this session, we talked about the reputational risk, and of course, reputational risk is something that is on high on every board's radar. It's an asset that's hard to build and easy to lose, and I guess venues, they know their venues better than their hirer does, so they're sort of damned if they do and damned if they don't. I guess I'm asking some of these other guys, in terms of reputational risk, how much does that influence your decision over health and safety compliance?
I wouldn't go as far as to say over health and safety compliance, but certainly reputational risk. And one of the risks I would say about something like a grand final, for instance, is there is a risk that the show is sort of mediocre. And so that pushes you into doing things that may see you take on more risk, but there's a balancing act there between cookie cutting the same show you did last year that we now can deliver is safe, is easy, everyone's happy with, and what does that look like for the NRL on their biggest day when they're putting their best foot forward and want to go out and entertain. And that's so there are trade-offs there. I wouldn't say it sort of supersedes, but you're certainly looking for those areas where you can advance a show in that instance.
And Sue, from a venue's perspective?
Yeah, I think certainly from our perspective is that there is no movement when it comes really to public safety. So we have to be very careful in the decisions that we make, the things that we agree to that could have an impact on people very rightly feeling they can come to the venue, they can have a great day at the venue and they can leave the venue safely. And we have that same obligation for our staff and our stakeholders. So there are some areas where we are completely immovable, where there becomes any question about public safety. But certainly in terms of making sure that, you know, we're creating great opportunity for the NRL and for ourselves as a business, there are some things, yes, that you might need to think a little differently about, and you might need to accept that there might be a bit of risk. But you have to have some good procedures and processes in place to manage that. So as a part of accepting the risk, you've got a plan to be able to mitigate it, and also looking for those foreseeable risks when you're doing things that you haven't necessarily done before as well is really important.
Lea, there's lots of grey areas. I think that's what you were implying there before. And I guess I'm interested to know then, how can venue managers understand some of those boundaries? What are some of the tests that the courts look for in how to understand and manage the grey areas where it's not specifically listed under a regulation, but we know that we've got a duty to deal with it?
Yep. So from that point of view, the key duty in the work health and safety laws, if I just go right back to first principles here, is a duty to ensure the health and safety of workers and other people. And what's important about how that duty operates is that the standard of care that we have to meet is a standard called so far as is reasonably practicable. You've all heard that concept, I'm sure. The question is, what does that mean and how does it get applied? And that's a question, I think, that every venue, every hirer and everyone in between needs to be asking themselves. So what is so far as is reasonably practicable in the thing that I'm trying to manage, in the show that I'm trying to put on, in the venue that I'm trying to manage? So the thing that courts look for is that test. They want to know, how far did you go? What is it that you did? Why is it that you made the decisions that you do? So when Sue speaks about risk and doing things, for example, that have not been done before, then a question will be asked about, well, how did you assess the risk? How did you determine what steps were the right ones to take? Have you gone as far as you needed to go? And importantly, if you decided not to do things, because remember, this is also the law that says you can be guilty of offences because of your acts or because of your omissions. So it's also the things that you choose not to do that are relevant here. So a question might be asked of a venue, well, you decided not to do something, why did you decide not to do that? So this concept of so far as reasonably practicable tries to deal with the grey that you're talking about, Wayne, because that's ultimately the test that the courts look for. And it's something I think that all of us sort of, we try to look to almost a methodology, a series of questions to ask yourself when you're testing, what is the steps that I need to take? How far do I need to go? What would be so far as reasonably practicable as the law sort of looks at it? They're the questions that need to be asked, and it backs out to first principles risk assessments. What's the likelihood of things happening? What's the severity when things go wrong? What information do I know? What information do I need to pass on? How do I look at risk in a particular way? They're the types of things that I think we need to be asking ourselves, and venues and hirers and everyone else who has duties all need to be asking themselves those questions along the way.
I guess then, to take that one step further in terms of that being of an evidentiary nature, it's always a challenge for us in getting the balance right of the documentation. We're not here as administrators, we're here as venue operators. How do we find that sweet spot? If it didn't get written down, it possibly didn't happen. More paper doesn't equal safer venue. How do we find that sweet spot in terms of level of documentation?
And I see lots of different approaches to this. Our regulators would say, if it's not written down, it didn't happen. But that's not actually right, because sometimes a risk assessment can be done verbally, it can be done quickly. Is that enough? It depends. It depends, and time will tell whether it is or not. But nonetheless, it still is a form of risk assessment. The fact that it hasn't been documented is not fatal. But having said that, the best types are the types where there is something written and there is some evidence of it, because it makes it easier to explain and to demonstrate to a regulator, in fact, what has been done if there's some written evidence of that risk assessment having been undertaken. And having been in writing.
Right. Okay, great. Sue,
Yes.
risk appetite. We talked a little bit about that before. What's changed in your venue and the way that you operate and the approach that you have to people like Stephen? Over the years, obviously, there's been legal action, there's inquiries and coroner's inquests and the like. And we know we've got to take risks. We have to open the doors. We can't turn the lights out. We need to operate. We must take risks. How is your organisation evolving in relation to your risk appetite?
In terms of our organisation, I think, and probably the same for everybody else, we're far more mature in this place than where we were 20 or 22 years ago. We were speaking to Lea before we came on, and I think you as well, Wayne, that risk management was a sort of a concept that nobody probably really understood as we went into the Olympic Games and what that actually meant. So lots and lots of things have changed. I think our approach, the difference where we are now compared to where we were is we're far more pragmatic. We are far more confident in testing and maybe challenging some things on occasions. And that's about creating some opportunity, because I think you used the word before, Wayne, is that risk is not always about not doing something. Sometimes risk is about doing something, and you accept that risk and you create an opportunity. There's more and more venues where we're not only just being, and we've had this experience ourselves, being the venue operator, but we've become promoters of events of our own as well. So again, pushing those boundaries. There's much more focus commercially in our industry, and sometimes you've got to push yourself to take some risk to create some financial opportunity as well, to have events come back to your venues. And we're living in a fairly competitive environment too, where we're all competing for events. So we don't want to be that venue where people go, we won't go there, it's really difficult to do business. So again, you have to think about those things. So it's not all about work health and safety. We do know that our ultimate responsibility, as I said, is around public safety. I don't know if my boss is in the crowd, but I do remember when we opened the stadium on the 6th of March 1999, and we all gathered around in a huddle before we went off to do whatever we were meant to be doing. We had no idea, but off we went with 104,000 people, and he said the only thing that can't happen today is we can't kill anybody, so we can manage everything else. So that is what guides us, I guess, in terms of our risk appetite. We have no appetite to kill anybody or injure anybody, but we certainly have a much greater appetite to do some things that we probably wouldn't have ever tried 20 years ago. And that's a part of working with people like Stephen as well.
Not killing someone's probably a good start, yeah. Steve, your business lives on the edge more. You need to push the limits. How's your and your clients' appetites changed in relation to that?
I guess one of the bits that we talk about, and Sue even alluded to it, that on the flip side of all the risks is a reward. I mean, you would never take on a risk without there being the reward there, and so the piece that has evolved, I guess, is the calculation around it. How do you calculate that risk, and how does that sort of in some ways price your reward? I think that's a bit that clients are interested in more increasingly. Some understand their sort of liability, some don't, but people are getting more educated around risk and how that works. So I think that's certainly a noticeable change over the last while.
Right. Thanks. Unfortunately, with the health and safety laws, there's lots of sticks and not that many carrots. And I think the sticks in many states have got bigger over the last couple of years. And I think the Dreamworld incident is a good example of that now, with Queensland introducing industrial manslaughter legislation. And hopefully you can speak more on how that's evolving around the country and what that actually means. But there's obviously significant increases in imprisonment for officers in particular, and fines for corporate bodies. So could you just talk a little bit about where that's at, what that means for venue operators, what does it mean for officers, so directors and officers of those businesses?
Sure, that's a big question. So what we are seeing is absolutely an increase in the penalties that courts are handing down for work health and safety breaches. So, I mean, when I sort of think about all the prosecutions in the last little while in New South Wales, There's many that are sitting at the $1 million mark now in terms of a financial penalty. And many people would say it's not about the money. It's actually about the reputation. It's about the impact that that has. It's about the negative publicity. It's about all the other things that flow from having a matter in a court. It's never a good feeling for anybody. There is no doubt in my mind that the focus of the regulator is absolutely on PCBUs, persons who conduct businesses or undertakings, so venue managers, hirers, and as I've said, every contractor all the way in between. But the focus is absolutely also on individuals, and our regulators around the country are asking more and more questions of officers, individual members of boards, senior leadership teams, etc. So there's many an occasion where an incident is investigated, and the actual incident is investigated in a micro kind of way, and regulators now take usually the full 2 years to undertake investigations over significant incidents. But at some point, the focus then shifts to individuals, and what did individuals do? What did they know? How can you prove it to me? Tell me what you've done for due diligence. What does that look like? And there is absolutely a shift, and the regulators know this, there is a shift to making individuals much more accountable than ever before. I think that's partly goes with the whole reputational question, but that's where the law is sort of shifting, and that's where the response of regulators is shifting. Part and parcel of all of this is a view, particularly among unions, that regulators don't go far enough, because I hear this all the time, and what we need in this country is industrial manslaughter laws. And what we have seen is that those laws have now been enacted in a number of states across the country. So they've been enacted in Queensland, let me get this right now, the ACT, Victoria and the Northern Territory. So all of those jurisdictions have industrial manslaughter laws. They're coming in Western Australia, when Western Australia moves to the model laws. So the two places where they're not is in New South Wales and South Australia, and there's no current plan to do that, although there has been talk in New South Wales that we may see industrial manslaughter provisions enacted there. What do they mean? What they've done is they've increased the financial penalties that apply if you commit an industrial manslaughter offence, and they've also increased the terms of imprisonment that may apply if an offence is proven. Now, that might make you think, my God, where are we getting to? One important thing to note about this, these types of laws have been in place for a long period of time, but they're not well used. So even though there may be a complaint that we need more in this space, the reality is we have not seen lots and lots of industrial manslaughter prosecutions in the country, but we keep hearing about it like there isn't, not the ability, but it is a space to watch. And if you're a director of a large company where, you have a fatality or, there's something that occurs, one of the very first phone calls that I always receive is, what's the individual liability position? So people are very focused on this area. And it is getting attention. Is it driving behaviour? Maybe. That's another question. Is it driving the right behaviour? Maybe. But is it also making people frightened about their liability? Absolutely. I think it is. But we've got a way to go just to see how this actually plays out in the country.
Okay. So let's cast our mind forward to State of Origin 3 across the way here, and we've got a venue hire agreement between the venue and the NRL, who aren't here represented, but they then in turn engage Stephen's company. So we've got these three entities that we've got listed here on the slide, and there's been a whole lot of planning and some of the stuff got written down, and then Stephen's gone away and engaged a contractor, a pyrotechnic company, and it's turned pear-shaped, and something's gone terribly wrong. Eden Park a few years ago, I think that happened, and fireworks go into the crowd. Some people are badly hurt. A question for Lea, then how does the regulator dissect that mess to figure out responsibility?
And dissect it, they will. That is what they will do.
Right.
So the way this goes is a regulator would come in, they would start at the incident. So if there's a person even just put at risk, they don't need to be injured. Let's think about just the risk scenario for the moment. If there is a person at risk, they will look at that, and it's like peeling the layers of an onion, one after the other off. They will try and work out, and it will take them a long time to do it, they'll try and work out the respective roles of each individual party. They'll be looking at the legislation and they'll be asking themselves who has a duty to a worker or to a member of the public, for example. They will then work that out the best that they can. They will then ask each of those parties individually questions about what the scope of their role, responsibilities are. What did they do for safety? How did they assess risk? You know, if there was a safe work method statement as to how those pyrotechnics were to be let off, who drafted it, who was involved in it, who understood it, who was trained in it. Do you have a record of that training? Can you give me evidence of what that looks like? Then give me all the documents that support all of that. And then once a person answers a question and said, yes, Fred, Joe and Sarah were involved, then there will be interviews with Fred, Joe and Sarah where all those questions will be asked again. This is the process that they go through until they work it all out. And sometimes they get it right and sometimes they get it wrong. And always it's a question of how do you want to turn up in those interviews? What will your level of cooperation be? Regulators have got very broad powers under work health and safety laws, so they can compel people to turn up to answer their questions. So, and their powers are much broader than the powers of New South Wales Police in many respects. And there's a reason for that, and that is that there is safety that sits at the heart of it, and that's the reason why the powers are cast in that way. So the regulators will know they've got their legislation and they're trying to work out who the respective parties are, what the scope of responsibilities are, and eventually if they think that they've got enough by way of evidence, they'll commence prosecution. Right. And what's relevant about that in the scenario that you just said, Wayne, and this is very common in work health and safety, that you have one incident that has multiple parties involved in it because, there may be in our scenario here, a venue, a hirer, a contractor, a subcontractor. It's very, very common in those scenarios that prosecutions would be commenced against each of them, so all of them.
So going back to my point before about documentation and getting that sweet spot and writing stuff down and ensuring that you're doing everything that's reasonable and practicable and really as a group, as a consultative group, the venue's in the best position to understand what that reasonable line is.
Maybe. It depends what the respective roles are. I mean, when I think about you, Sue, and the venue, you've kind of got responsibility over the hardware, so to speak. You're giving a venue to someone to do something in it. There's the information that you will know about that venue that you must pass on to Steve. When Steve comes in and he wants to put pyrotechnics, but he needs to, plug into the electrical system of a venue, for example, there's information flows that need to go this direction. When you then go and subcontract a piece of your work out to someone else to do, you're passing perhaps some of Sue's information on, but also then your own. You're getting a safe work method statement back, you're looking at it, you're wondering, should I look at that as well? Which was like the first question that you asked. And if there is a very strong interaction between work perhaps that a subby is doing that links into you, Sue, then maybe you should be looking at it with your oversight. So it doesn't take long before we can start thinking about scenarios and you can start unravelling what they are. That's what our regulators typically do. And as I said, Wayne, they're a bit hit and miss sometimes. They sort of get some things and they fluff some other things up, but therein lies opportunity as well.
Can we make a comparison then with the coroner's court? So some people in this room, I know Jim Fiddler, others have been dragged up in front of coroners before. I have myself for the Vivid fatality. most states in Australia now have had major incidents that have either ended in a fatalities or major injuries. There's been, WorkSafe prosecutions. The Northern Territory major events are a client of ours, and they had an enforceable undertaking enacted a few years ago for an incident that happened in Alice Springs. The Dreamworld one that we saw a couple of years ago in Queensland. In terms of how the courts approach a coroner's inquest versus the regulator, what are the differences?
Completely different. So the coroner is not bound by the rules of evidence or anything. They can just decide what the issues are. They can call people up. This is the actual coroner themselves. It's an inquiry, so you've got to think about it like that. A work health and safety investigation and prosecution, you've got a very standard way in which allegations are formed and they're put, so a collection of failures or breaches of the Work Health and Safety Act. Because they are criminal charges, you know exactly the case that you're to meet, but with an inquest, an inquest scenario is a completely different one. There is no sort of allegations put to a party. You've got to be a person interested. You have to seek permission to appear at an inquest. But once you do, and the coroner decides that you are an interested party, then they are at large to ask you anything. And they do that. They can ask anything they like. They've got broad powers to call anyone to give evidence. Ultimately, though, what the coroner will do is they're charged with determining the manner and cause of death of a person. So there needs to be a death. It needs to be in a particular circumstance. It's discretionary as to whether there is an inquest held over an incident or not. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. And families, I think, have a lot to do with that and how they're pushing. But the thing that a coroner can do is make recommendations. And then it's up to the party to whom the recommendation is made to look at that recommendation and determine whether they will take the step that the recommendation is asking for. So, we've had, you mentioned Darling Harbour. There was a drowning of a fellow who was at Darling Harbour watching Vivid. There were a whole lot of recommendations made to a number of government departments. They have to then determine what they do with those recommendations and how far they go. And when recommendations are made of government, it's another whole kind of universe, because government really should be complying with what the coroner says. But sometimes it depends on what those recommendations are, how workable they are and how they can be achieved. But inquests are loose and fancy free, I call them. And often you have your work health and safety regulators, they're there, they're sitting and they're listening. They get a free kick because they get to look at all the evidence that the coroner has asked, and they can use that evidence. If there is an inquest in New South Wales, just to put it out there, that has the effect of stopping time on a work health and safety prosecution, or extending the time limits in which a prosecution can be commenced. So your Safe Work, for example, could sit in a coronial inquest and listen to all the evidence that comes out, use that evidence in whichever way, either to ascertain more people to interview or other evidence to try and collect, and use that information to bolster their work health and safety case.
Loose and fancy-free, Your Honour.
Correct.
Sue, you and I have spoken about the coroner and how that motivates you as a venue planner. Do you want to share some of those thoughts?
Yeah, I'm not sure if it motivates me. It certainly terrifies me, which leads with motivation. I had never really given very much thought to this really, early on in my career, but in more recent years, and picking up on some of the things that Lea has said as we've learned through our journey around managing risk and public safety. But I think the thing that really came home to me, and with some of my colleagues, was a forum we went to in Canberra a couple of years ago, and a very eminent QC, Mr Freckleton, who was representing the New South Wales Police Force, I think as a part of the coroner's inquiry after the Lint Cafe, was really terrifying to listen to. Well-trained, a good organisation that had done their very, very best, on that given day and night to save life, but, you know, destroyed a lot of great people in the process, and many police officers that we knew very well. And we know that we have a very good police force. So that was a real wake-up call, I think, for us as an organisation to say, what more do we need to be doing? Because I think, you know, ending up at the coroner's court is because there has been a massive failure. And as you said, that would relate more than likely, or only if there was to be a death, which would be the worst possible thing that could happen to any of us. So that has been an absolute motivation for us to understand. But the other thing that's come out of that is what comes out of the coroner's court in finding if somebody wants then to take further action against you based on those findings. Because that's not, as I understand it, Lea, the end of the journey, always. And then something that somebody else said to me just recently, which was a real thought provoker, is you could actually become an adversary personally with your employer, given the evidence that you might need to give as a result of any further action that might be taken, or within the coroner's court itself. And certainly in the little bit of reading, or the reading I've done a little bit, quite a lot, but what I understand for Dreamworld, that has certainly been the case, you know, with staff who said they weren't trained properly, they didn't understand how things worked, you know, talking about safety protocols, all of those sorts of things. Again, a real eye-opener for all of us. This is not just sitting down and saying what could go wrong, it's all the things you spoke about around having evidence that we have done what we say that we do. And I think in the past we've all been guilty of writing plans because we've had to write something, but there's nothing sitting under it to actually prove what we do. And that's certainly probably in the last decade been a much greater focus for us as well, for all of us. And that's the stuff that certainly keeps me awake at night when you think about certainly ending up in the coroner's court or in any civil action or work cover or wherever you might head to next over something that could be quite serious.
Thanks, Sue. I'm mindful of the time. We've got a couple of minutes left. Are there some questions from the floor? Up the back there, Heather?
Yep, I'll go to Paul.
There's a couple.
Paul McCarthy, PBM Safety. Just a quick one. If we look at the complexity of international artists coming to venues in Australia, looking at that whole chain down the list of who should know what about what's happening, I think there's there's potentially a need for us to be utilising the background of the Occupational Health and Safety Act that sort of talks around, there's some levels of project management that a lot of construction is based on, I suppose, 250 here and 350,000 here, and the Northern Territory's 400,000, etc. But there's some good guidance in that to say potentially identifying all of those parties, like was up on Wayne's diagram, have them all listed and their duties, and they all agree to that. But obviously the complexity that we have with that is if the artist is booked from overseas, they've got a whole bunch of their law that might have been written in California to talk about how this is going to happen, and the production manager's hired over there and has, last say on everything. So we get this complexity of venue hire agreements and how they tie in the depth of that. I've seen lots of circumstances where you've got a big chain of command and a very wide branch, and how do you identify all of those? I mean, it's an issue for someone from WorkSafe to sometimes come into a venue and see everything being okay and being able to report appropriately to the right people to say, hey, everything was okay. But it's even worse, obviously, when something's going wrong.
Well, yes, it's you focus on it when something goes wrong, and that is precisely the time at which the unravelling occurs. I suppose there'd be benefit in, from time to time, putting yourself in that situation and actually asking yourself, if I were to unravel this situation right now, a job that I'm doing at a venue, for example, who are the relevant parties? What are the relevant responsibilities? What does that actually look like? You raise an interesting comment about people who are from overseas who come here. There's really interesting legal jurisdictional questions as to whether a regulator here could go after someone not here. The answer is generally no, but there'll be some nexus and some connection with the country. Someone would have engaged that person here, and it's not so much, well, it's obviously if there is a risk to that person, let's say our overseas artist, the question is how did that risk get created, who created it, what's their responsibility, what does that look like? It's an unravelling exercise each and every time, and every circumstance is different.
We've got time for one more?
Yeah.
Yeah, there was one more up, midway up the seating tier
Who's
there.
got a question? Hands up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, thank you. It's Pedro from Keyclean again. One of the questions I have is the cleaning industry being one of the probably the third subcontractors that bring most of employees for event to be run before, during, and after. Are venues still willing to allow subcontracting in that sector to provide, or is that risk that the venues are still willing to take?
Did you understand the question?
I think your question's really around subcontracting and whether it's permitted or the extent to which it's done. I think that's what you're asking. That's a question for each and every one of you, because I think in some ways a lot of subcontracting occurs, and what I see is that many principals, if I can call it that, sometimes don't even know that aspects of work have been subcontracted to others. So in terms of contractual positions, I see all types of contracts where subcontracting is allowed or subcontracting is not allowed. You've just got to make a decision as to what it is. And if it is allowed, the question then becomes, what do you want to know about that? When should you know about it? What information should you be collecting about it? To get yourself in a position where you're comfortable. And you've got to ask yourself the question about risk as well. How's that going to be managed? Many work health and safety incidents that happen are often in that sort of contractual chain that you spoke about, Michael, where there's a lot of parties in a chain. Something happens all the way down here, it gets backed out as to where the responsibility lies.
Okay.
Yep,
Well,
Eddie's got a question. We're
Eddie.
okay.
Yep.
Hi guys, Eddie from Vital Protection Group, and thank you for that presentation. It's quite good information that we can take away. One of my questions is, my business got over 150 staff members that we have to manage around Australia, and in regards to health and safety, documenting, getting access to health and safety information within that workplace, we are now moving over to technology with applications where all our staff can put data into the central database of their own work sites and risks and hazards identified and what actions are taken, just to create that data pool where we can prove that we're showing good practice if something did turn up. We've got a history of all documentation throughout, and getting our staff to contribute most of the time to that information. So are you seeing a shift now moving away from, say, hard copy, archive style of documentation when we're just building dust, moving over to putting the power into all your staff now that can contribute to the health and safety process as being a PCBU?
I've seen quite a shift, and something that Sue said a minute ago is really critical on this. In my mind, it doesn't matter if there is a whole lot of paper or there's an electronic system. Whatever you put in it and whatever you say you're going to do, make sure you do it. Because once you document it in that way, that becomes discoverable. Your database is discoverable. You'll have to hand it over if there is an incident. And if there's something in there that says, and we were going to do this, or we spotted a risk and this was our action, or whatever it might be, you will come undone if you haven't done the things that you've committed to do. So all great to have systems, processes, plans, paper or electronic, in place, just do the things that you say that you're going to do. That's the most important thing with whatever format in which it sits.
Yeah, I think there's a definite trend towards technology. No one likes doing risk assessment. I know it's boring, but it's a really important part of event delivery. And if there's a technological solution that can make that process more efficient and get a better use of the data that's being collected out of it, then I'm all for it. I guess we're just about out of time,
Yeah.
Heather. Is that right?
Yeah, I've just got one question for Sue and maybe Stephen. Do you read every risk assessment that comes into your venue? And does every contractor write a risk assessment and do swims for you, Stephen? And then you write one and your contractors have got one and then Sue's gathering all of them? Like, how do you keep, like, from your point of view and then Sue's point of view, and then, or do you rely on, if the NRL are your contractor, are the NRL reading your risk assessments?
So we'll produce a risk assessment for every event we undertake, and I will read those, and so will production manager, event manager, and we pass those on to the NRL and whatever venue we happen to be in at the time. And as part of that process, I mean, that's a document that is created for us. As part of that process, we will go and collect risk assessments or swims or whatever it may be from, and insurances and everything from all our suppliers and bundle that up in a sort of online document that's available to venue, client, whomever needs access to it at that time.
Yes, certainly from our point of view, I think it comes back to a point that Lea made, is in reading and critiquing and signing off on a lot of this stuff, how much are you implicating yourself if you actually don't have the skill set and the knowledge to actually be doing that? It certainly is the case in the relationship that we have with Stephen, is that we will ask for their risk assessments as it relates to the venue and the running the venue and things that we have control over. We will certainly make sure that we are reading all of those. We'll make sure that there is evidence of all the information that we do need, and on occasions as need be we will get somebody with that expertise to come in to represent us to read that if it's a big enough risk that we feel that we need some expertise that we actually don't have in-house.
I got dragged up in front of the coroner for that vivid fatality, and while I was waiting to go in the box, I must have heard, and I've told this many times, I must have heard the term risk assessment brought up 30 times. And it was the counsel assisting asking who wrote it, who checked it, how did it get communicated to the security guy, how did that person pass it on to the person who was working on the shift, how did it make its way into the head of the person who was managing that space around the harbour, and by the way, why didn't it cover the risk of drowning if it was an event on the harbour? And all those things are very obvious in hindsight. But have you got any other comments, Lea?
No, just the hindsight, which is...
It's a beautiful thing.
The space that a lot of this operates. Things are very clear after the event.
Yeah.
And they're not often clear when it's playing out in front of you. But that's the challenge. If you would take away one thing now, it would be put yourself in that position, ask yourself those questions, not all the time, but from time to time. I think it's a good exercise. If something were to happen right now, how would we go? What would our documentation look like? How would we feel about standing up in the coroner's court and answering those questions?
So I might wrap it up there. Look, I guess as a summary, a healthy paranoia for a venue manager is a good thing. We do have to laugh a lot and get the balance right, but I think every venue manager is a risk manager, and keep asking yourself, have we done enough? Can we defend our position if the worst case scenario occurs and we've got to stand up in front of a court? So please join me now in thanking our panellists, Lea Constantine, Sue Max and Stephen Davey. Thank you.
Thank you.